Okay, welcome back. In the video series so far, what we've been doing is slowly building out an application that can store volunteer information. And in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to create the login screen. There's a few steps to doing that. First step is we're going to create a view that will accept the volunteer ID. Their password is going to have the ability to display a message and have some kind of a submit button. So that's pretty easy to do in Scene Builder. The next thing we're going to do is, using that volunteer ID, we'll query the database and get the encrypted password and the salt from the database. And we'll convert that password into an encrypted password using the salt from the database. And then what we're going to do is we compare the encrypted passwords, the one that's stored in the database and the one that we just generated. If they're the same, we'll go to the view with all the volunteers. If they're not, then what we'll do is we'll update the message and have the user log in again. So that's the goal of this video. Oh, let's take a look at this. So step one here, create a view with volunteer ID, password, message, and submit button. So let's go into development environment here. Okay, so we, again, if you're new to this video series, the video series has several videos before this where we've created our app. We have several package areas for images, models, views, and controllers. And what we're going to do is, under the views, I'm going to say new empty XML, and I'll call this the login view. Use a Java controller. We'll use a cascading style sheet, and we'll use an existing one called volunteer. We haven't really done much styling yet, but we'll just connect them all up so that they're all there. And then when we do choose to update that style sheet, we can affect all of our views at once. Okay, so let's go to our login view. If I double click on it, it's going to launch Scene Builder for me, hopefully. And then we're going to make it the same size as all of our other items. So I'm going to click on the anchor pane. Go to layout. This is 800 by 600. And we'll put in a vertical box. And I'll right click and say fit to parent. And now I can add in all of my controls. So put in a label. And then we can add in do a grid pane. And in my grid, I'll add in a couple labels. So this one can be volunteer ID. And this one could be password. And if we take a text field, and we'll get a password field for our password. Password field. We can delete this. Yeah. And then we're going to need a message, so we'll put in a label. And lastly, we will need a button that says log in. Obviously, this doesn't look so great. So let's click on our V box and we'll add some padding around the outside. And padding between, spacing between elements. The other thing we should do is let's center everything. So rather than have everything aligned to the top left, let's say center. And maybe top center. Okay. Now our grid pane here is a lot wider than we probably really need it to be. So we can do a couple different options here. Probably easiest is we'll say max. So right now the width is 760. So maybe we can shrink this down and say, let's make this in 400. Slide that over. And then it's a little bunched up in here. So again, I'll go back to my grid pane and let's put in 10 pixels. That looks better. Okay, and we have a lot of screen real estate left here, so we could add an image or something to this, and we'll pretty it up a little bit later in a future use case. But for now, it'll allow us the ability to log in. So let's hit save. So we're going to have to name these three elements here, right? So the volunteer ID, the password field, and the label, so that we can work with these in our controller. So let's go to our controller here. And we'll add in fxml private. And then we can add in our imports. Always making sure to use the JavaFX ones. See how there's AWT and then there's JavaFX. Do not choose the AWT, we need the FX. Okay, so now that we have each of these fields, we can now interact with them. So if I go down right now, our error message, look at our view, it actually says the word label on it. So I'm going to just say, set the text to be the empty string. I'm not going to make it visible and invisible. You can do that as well. But I'll just set it to be the empty string for now. And then we need to know what to do when the user pushes the button. So we'll create a method for that. Remember, for our change scene utility, we need to capture the action event of actually pushing the button. So capture that, and pass that into our method. So if the login button is pushed, what do we want it to do? Well, we want it to read from this field, right? So this is where if we go here, we've created our view. Oops. And we want to use the volunteer ID and query the database. Okay. So if the button's pushed, what do we want to do? Well, we want to say, we want to set up a query in the database, right? So we're going to query the database. With the volunteer ID provided. So in order to do that, we're going to need a connection. And we'll need a prepared statement. We need to use a prepared statement because we're getting inputs from the user. So we need to first sanitize those before we use them, before we send it into the database in case someone's trying to do a SQL injection attack. So in this case, I'm going to need to convert this volunteer ID right now is in a text field. I need to convert that into an actual integer because in our database, load this up here. In our database, it's our primary key. It's defined as an integer. So we need to convert into an integer. Remember what I stored this under? I called it volunteer. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this ID, that field, as you can see here, it's an integer, right? So that volunteer ID we need to convert into an integer. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say volunteer number equals this method parseInt can accept a string, so then I can pass that text field to get the text. Now I have a volunteer number, and I can start to build out my query. Back to the database. Mine again is just on my local host. You could use over the internet type of URL information here. We have to put in our username and password. In mine, I just happen to do student. We'll do our throws our catch here. So step one, we connect to our database. Step two, we're going to we'll create a query string. Here, I'm going to say string SQL equals. I'm going to select the password, the salt, volunteers, where volunteer ID equals. And this is where I use the question mark. And again, this is how we're going to guard against the SQL injection attack. 3, we prepare the statement. In step 4, what we're going to do is we're going to bind basically this question mark to our volunteer number up here. So in that case, oops. So at this point, we're ready. We can execute our query. I create this up here. Create something called the result set. This is what gets returned from our database query. And it always assumes multiple, it's always going to assume multiple rows are returned. In our case, it's only going to return one. That's the whole point of the primary key, but we still treat it as if there's multiple rows returned. So then step 6, check the password. Move over it, even though the loop's only going to execute one time. So we'll say db password. We get the string, and the string that we're looking for in our database we called password, right? So if we look here, the field we're looking for is called password. Now to get the salt, which is a blob, that's like a binary set of data, we're going to do a couple steps here. Okay, so the first step is we're going to get the actual blob from our database. So again, here we just called it the salt. So I'm going to use that field name. But then what we have to do is we have to convert that. So because it was a byte array originally, so I'll also put up here, I'll say look at the length of the blob. then salt, we'll say I guess we could actually just say this Bob, it fights. Okay, so now we have our encrypted password here, and we have the salt that we would need to generate it. So the next thing we need to do is convert the password given by the user to an encrypted. In this case, we'll say string. Okay, new object. I'll say the user's password equals, and this is where we can use our password generator, right? So we'll say password generator. And then here we can get the password. And what we'll do is we'll pass in the password field. Okay. So that password field is what was used um, on our view. So if we go back to our view, there's our password field. So that's, although to the user, they're just going to see little black dots. But what we actually want is to get this string out of that. So we'll pass this in, and we'll have to say get the text. And salt might not have been initialized. Go. Click it there. Okay, and then now we have an encrypted user password. We have the password that's in the database, and we just have to check. So we say if user password equals the database password, that's true. That's the true. Then what we want to do is we want to do some more compact. Let's match change to the volunteer table view. Okay, so here we can use our scene changer. Let's, so change scenes, and we already have our event. And the view we want to go to is called the volunteer table view. And then we put in the title of all volunteers. Add a throws clause. And if they don't match, update the error message. And the only other thing we need to do at this point, we hit save. We need to connect up our view. So load the code. And we'll hit save. So now this is connected to our controller. And then when we launch our program, we need to use this view instead of the volunteer table view. So here we will use, called it login view. If we hit run, it loads, and let's just take a look in our database here. I think I used simple for these last two, so we'll do volunteer number 12 and the password of simple. And if we hit login, nothing seems to happen. Well, what's going on? So let's take a look here at our setup when we were creating our login view. So if I hit play right now, we don't get any error messages. As soon as I hit the login button, this is where the problem comes in. So we need to figure out what's going wrong with our login view controller. And if we look in here, this is where we set up our database connection, and that is likely where things are going awry. So we have a table called volunteers here. Here's the issue. It should be called volunteer. Type in the correct password, simple, and we hit login. Oh, unknown column PW in field list. Okay, so let's go down. It says select PW here. I should have said select password. And okay, so slow and steady progress here. So now, looks like we run into a new issue. So let's see what happens here. So now we get to the point where we can actually create an event by the looks of things. Okay, so invocation target exception. Illegal state, location is not set. So it looks like we made it to line 79, which means the passwords were equal. So everything above here is great. But then when we went to change scenes, legal state exception, on line 26, doesn't like loading our actual resource. So let's see, we passed in the view name that we wanted and the title. So the view name was volunteer table view. But what I forgot was the .fxml. Let's try that. We log in, and it works. And it looks like we've got an extra print statement in here from our previous troubleshooting. So we'll get rid of that. But this allows us to log in a valid user. And when we do this again, and if I put in the wrong password, hit login, it says the volunteer ID and passwords do not match, and it doesn't allow me to go on, type in the password, and now it'll let us go in. So now we have although it's maybe not the prettiest, we do have a login view and a login view controller that allows us to validate the user and move them on. And I'm just going to clean up this last little bit here. This came from our volunteer table. When we were troubleshooting in a previous video, so get rid of that. So now we should be in a good space. There we go. Excellent. All right, great. So I'm going to also put this code onto GitHub. The link will be in the YouTube description, and I hope that this was helpful for you. Cheers.